Welcome, fellow historians, to a journey beyond the known chronicles of the Imperium. We often speak of Paul Atreides, the rise of the God Emperor, and the scattering. The forgotten lore, decipher the cryptic symbols, and piece together the epic sagas that shaped humanity's destiny among the stars. Subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss our first expedition into the deep past. The spice isn't the only treasure Arrakis holds.
They ruled not through love, but through silence. For 10,000 years, the golden lions of Corrino sat upon the lion throne. Their banners stretched across the stars, their name whispered like a prayer and a threat. But every dynasty believes itself eternal. Every ruler imagines that fear can hold what wisdom once built. And so the Imperium decayed, not in the chaos of rebellion, but in the stillness of obedience. The Corrinos mastered the art of survival by turning empire into theater and loyalty into performance. But behind the gold, behind the ceremony, something hollow began to grow. Because when power becomes ritual, it forgets its purpose. And from that forgetting comes the trap. Every empire tells itself a story of divine right, of chosen blood, of order ordained by heaven. For the Corrinos, that story began with conquest, but it endured through belief. They were the keepers of balance, the stewards of peace after the long shadow of the Butlerian Jihad. Their throne on Kaitain was not merely political, it was sacred. The Padishah emperor was seen as the living center of civilization, a single will binding 1,000 feuding worlds. But history hides its warnings in the language of glory. For in preserving their dominion, the Corrinos built a machine of fear, a system so vast and ceremonial that it forgot the pulse of the people it ruled. To rule the Imperium was to master illusion, to make the powerful believe they were loyal, and the oppressed believe they were safe. But how long can fear masquerade as faith? And what happens when the illusion itself begins to crumble? The story of House Corrino begins not in triumph, but in aftermath. When the fires of the Butlerian Jihad finally dimmed, the universe was broken. Humanity had shattered its own chains, destroying the thinking machines that once ruled it. But what rose in the silence that followed was something just as perilous: the hunger for order. Out of this void stepped the Corrino dynasty, a house forged in the crucible of survival. Their founder, Viceroy Kaitain Butler, descendant of the Jihad's holy warriors, renamed his line Corrino to sever the past, to cleanse the bloodline of fanaticism and fire. He crowned himself emperor of the known universe, not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizer, the guardian of humanity's fragile new order. Yet beneath the sanctity of his title lay a truth as old as empire itself. He who restores peace inherits power. And from that inheritance, tyranny was born. In the ashes of rebellion, the first kings are always called saviors. The Corrinos understood something the rest of the great houses did not. That rule was not sustained through armies, but through dependencies. They built the Landsraad to divide noble ambition, and sanctioned the Spacing Guild to control the stars. Each faction, the Bene Gesserit, the Mentats, the Houses Major, was given just enough freedom to serve, but never enough to threaten. The Corrino throne became the still point around which the Imperium revolved. Their power was not absolute, but it was indispensable. To the people, the emperor was the embodiment of divine balance. To the houses, he was the mediator of greed. And to the guild, he was the one who signed their survival into law. The Corrinos had built a cage, not one of iron, but of interdependence. And like all perfect systems, it depended on one illusion, that no one would ever dare to shake it. A throne built on fear will stand for ages, until someone remembers what courage feels like. Kaitain, the imperial capital, became a theater of eternity. Golden domes reflected 1,000 suns. Servants moved in silence, and every motion of the emperor's hand echoed across light years. But the grandeur was not decoration, it was strategy. Ceremony replaced conviction. Tradition replaced truth. The Corrinos learned that ritual could do what armies could not. It could hypnotize generations into obedience. No one dared question the system that gave the meaning. The Imperium became a religion, and the throne, its altar. But in the long corridors of Kaiten's palaces, a quiet decay began to creep in, because when power depends on perception, truth becomes dangerous. And in the silence of perfection, history began to rot. As centuries passed, the Corrinos became prisoners of their own design. Their bloodline grew thinner, their vision narrower. Each emperor inherited not wisdom, but caution, a fear of change masked as devotion to order. Their empire was a symphony played too long, beautiful once, but hollow now. Its notes echo only to preserve the illusion of music. The great houses plotted in the shadows, the Bene Gesserit whispered of new bloodlines, and on distant Arrakis, the sand began to move. But on Kaitain, the emperor still believed himself untouchable. He mistook silence for loyalty. He mistook fear for faith. And in that fatal blindness, the trap he had built for others began to close around him. The longer an empire survives, the more it forgets what made it worthy of survival. By the time of Shaddam IV, the Corrino dynasty had ruled for millennia. But their empire, though vast, though glittering, was already hollow. Shaddam inherited not confidence, but paranoia. He ruled not as a conqueror, but as a man haunted by the ghost of his own lineage. He was intelligent, ambitious, even visionary in moments. But his heart was a prisoner of fear. Fear of the Landsraad's ambitions. Fear of the Bene Gesserit's breeding schemes. Fear of the Guild's silent dominance of space. And above all, fear of House Atreides, the rising power whose honor had become its own myth. To the people, the Corrino lions still roared. But behind the throne, Shaddam could hear the faint crack of age in every echo. He ruled an empire that no longer believed in the myth of its own eternity. For centuries, the Corrinos had survived by playing factions against one another, a delicate dance of rivalry and reward. But Shaddam's reign revealed the flaw in that design. A balance of fear requires perfect control. And control, like prophecy, always fails in time. The Spacing Guild, unseen and untouchable, controlled all interstellar travel. A monopoly that the Emperor himself depended upon. The Bene Gesserit, bound to no world, manipulated bloodlines from within. The Siem Company, the Empire's economic engine, answered not to the throne, but to profit. Each institution had become its own empire, and the Emperor, once master, now ruled only through appearances. He had inherited a cage of his ancestors' making. He sat at the center of the Imperium's web, but every thread now pulled against him. The throne of the Corrinos no longer ruled the Imperium, it performed it. Then came House Atreides, noble, disciplined, dangerously admired. Their Duke, Leto Atreides, embodied everything the Corrinos had forgotten. Justice, loyalty, courage without deception. In the courts of Kaitain, whispers grew that the Atreides, not the Emperor, carried the true spirit of leadership. To a ruler of fear, admiration is treason. Shaddam saw the Atreides not as allies, but as contagion, a story that could replace his own. And so he did what all decaying empires do. He turned preservation into violence. In alliance with House Harkonnen, he lured the Atreides to Arrakis, the desert planet, the only source of the spice melange, the lifeblood of the Imperium. Publicly, it was a political reshuffling, a noble transfer of stewardship. Privately, it was a death sentence. The Emperor believed he was setting a trap. But what he truly built was prophecy. The plan was perfect in design, brutal in execution. The Sardaukar, the Emperor's sacred army, raised in the prisons of Seleucus Secundus, feared across the galaxy for their devotion and cruelty, were disguised as Harkonnen troops. When the massacre came, it wasn't very merciful. The Atreides fell. Leto was killed, and Shaddam believed he had secured peace once again. But beneath the sands, a new power stirred, a son, Paul, and a destiny far older than the Imperium itself. In trying to destroy his rival, Shaddam created his god. It was the ancient paradox. the tyrant who believes he preserves order, is often the very architect of its end. The emperor had set his trap perfectly, but he had forgotten that fear cannot outlive faith. When Paul Atreides rose from the desert, he rose not as a man, but as a myth. The freemen called him Muad'Dib, a name whispered with both devotion and dread. He became what the Imperium had forgotten, a symbol, a faith born not from ritual but from struggle, a movement that no throne could contain. And when he struck back, the Lion Throne trembled for the first time in 10,000 years. Shaddam, the master of illusion, found himself stripped of the very myth that had sustained his house. The people no longer feared the emperor. They feared the Messiah he had created. The Corrino dynasty, once the architect of human order, was now the victim of its own perfection. The empire that ruled through ritual met a god who needed none. In Dune, Frank Herbert was never writing about Shaddam IV or the fall of one house. He was writing about us. The Imperium is a mirror, a civilization trapped in its own reflection. Its golden palaces, its ceremonies, its systems of loyalty and fear. All of them exist to answer a single question humanity never stops asking. How do we control chaos? The Corrinos answered with order, the Atreides with honor, the freemen with faith. And yet each, in their own way, became prisoners of what they created. Because every empire, whether on Kaitain or on Earth, eventually confuses control with purpose. It forgets why it began. And when meaning dies, only power remains to fill the void. An empire does not fall when its enemies attack. It falls when it no longer remembers why it deserves to exist. The Corrinos believed fear was a foundation, that if men were too afraid to rebel, peace would endure. But fear is not a foundation. It's erosion. It wears away faith, trust, innovation, until only obedience remains. And obedience, without belief, is lifeless. Shaddam's rule collapsed not because he lacked strength, but because he lacked imagination. His empire could not inspire. And in Herbert's universe, the death of imagination is the death of civilization. For 10,000 years, the Corrinos maintained the machine of empire. But they never asked why it should survive. Only how. That how became their cage. When power becomes habit, it no longer serves, it consumes. Paul Atreides was not simply a revolutionary. He was the manifestation of everything the Corrinos feared. A leader who commanded not armies, but belief. A ruler whose legitimacy came not from ceremony, but prophecy. In the desert, the myths the Corrinos had dismissed took root again. The people no longer needed the emperor's golden light. They carried their own fire. And in that moment, the trap of empire revealed its final design. The more perfectly one controls others, the more fragile that control becomes. Shaddam had tried to destroy meaning itself, to reduce politics to precision, religion to ritual, and rebellion to rumor. But meaning, like the desert, always returns. And it returned in the form of a boy who saw the universe not as a system, but as destiny. The emperor lost his throne the moment he believed men could be ruled forever. Frank Herbert's genius was not prophecy, it was recognition. He understood that power's greatest illusion is its permanence. That no matter how vast the empire, how ancient the bloodline, how sacred the ritual, it ends the same way. Not with a war cry, but with silence. The silence of people who stop believing. House Corrino's fall is not a tragedy, it is a pattern. The same pattern that topples dynasties, collapses nations, and repeats throughout human history. We build systems to protect us from chaos, and those systems become the chaos themselves. We crown leaders to bring us peace, and worship them until peace becomes impossible. The empire's true lesson is not how it ruled, but how easily we learn to serve. Look beyond the stars of the Imperium, and you will see the reflection still. In every government that values control over conscience. In every institution that confuses stability with life. In every leader who mistakes obedience for faith. House Corrino ruled through fear, and in doing so, became its own prisoner. Paul Atreides rose through belief, and in doing so, unleashed a war of faith the universe could not contain. Herbert leaves us no heroes, only mirrors, because in the end, every empire is both warning and prophecy. Every ruler believes they can master the tide, and every age must learn again that the tide obeys no throne. Power is a flame, and every hand that clings to it will one day burn. In the end, House Corrino did not fall in battle. It withered. The empire they built from fear dissolved into faith, and the throne they guarded for 10,000 years was swallowed by the very myth they tried to contain. Shaddam IV was not defeated by armies, but by the truth that no ruler can outlive the story his people choose to believe. The Imperium moved on, but the pattern remained, because every age finds its Corrinos, and every Corrino builds his trap anew. In the end, every empire is just dust waiting for the wind. Subscribe, and remember, history always repeats itself, even in the Imperium.